And we're so happy to welcome everybody today for our, what was supposed to be our June Climate Cafe in honor of Pride Month has now been postponed to July, and we're equally happy to host it with our guest, Bob Vallier, who is the chair of Democrats Abroad LGBTQ+ caucus, and he will be introducing us to the ideas behind queer ecology and why that matters for the environment and the climate. I'm Dana Freeling, the chair of Democrats Abroad Environment and Climate Crisis Council, and we have with us as well Angela Fobbs, our in charge of so many things in Democrats Abroad, but also our communications director. And we are delighted to engage. This should be an informal event. People should feel comfortable and at ease to ask questions. We are all here learning together. So welcome. And with that, I will hand it over to Bob, who will tell us a little about him, where he votes for, who he is, and make us.
Nobody's interested in me, but
everybody's interested in you, Bob.
You know, you said my name in the French way, Vallier, which is perfectly fine, but in the United States, it's Vallier, rhymes with queer, and I never heard that before in my life. In fact, I heard it every day as a teen. So, I'm from Michigan. I vote in Flint. I live in Italy. My PhD is in contemporary French philosophy, so why I'm the academic director of a program focusing on the Italian Renaissance in Florence is kind of a mystery. But in any case, in continental philosophy in particular, French philosophy as well, there are quite a number of important resources that have been developed since the 1960s, really. And then there are people who have appropriated those resources and put them to work in various ways. And a lot of this thing called queer ecology, which is a kind of a mysterious phrase, comes from that particular field. So I'm not an expert in queer ecology, but you know, because of my background in continental philosophy, because I'm very familiar, in fact, studied with one of the people who is an important resource for the development of this particular discourse, and have been to countless conferences where I've heard many papers related to this theme, I thought, well, I could probably say something about this. So I'll talk for about 20 minutes in fairly general terms. I'll try to resist my professional deformation of talking in philosophies very much, although in a couple of cases, I don't know that I can avoid it, but I'll be as clear as possible. Just a few of the, broad ideas that constitute or comprise this discourse called queer ecology. And I want to begin a little bit obliquely. I am indeed the chair of the Global LGBT Caucus, and all of last week, this week, and next week, I'm focused on Amsterdam Pride. So, if you haven't had a chance to donate to that yet, you can still do so. There's my plug. And I'm the, chair of the LGBTQ+ caucus because I'm Q, I'm queer. Vallier rhymes with queer, right? I'm actually one of in the minority of people who don't have a problem with the word queer, and tend to use it more broadly than most people in the community do. These days, I think lots of us refer to us as the alphabet people, LGBTQIA 2S+, it just goes on forever. So I just abbreviate it with queer. And the reason I begin with that little factoid is because really since the foundation of the church, and I was just in Rome yesterday at the Vatican, My skin was burning. Since the foundation of the church, the Catholic Church first of all, but the Protestant churches in particular, I have been unnatural. Unnatural. Homosexuality is unnatural, according to the church, which is a kind of an interesting development, because before the foundation of the church, in the Greek world, in the Roman world, in the Hebrew world, in the Levant, homosexuality was a perfectly natural phenomenon, although it wasn't called homosexuality, because that word was invented only in the late 19th century by one of the early sexologists, pre-Freud. And it was opposed immediately to the heterosexual, which was declared normative, right? So heterosexuality is normal and natural, homosexuality is abnormal and unnatural. I remember, I think it was Pope John Paul II, but it might have been Benoit, I forget, or Benedict, issued an encyclical not too very long ago, in which, they tried to be all nice and tolerant, but they said that homosexuals were inherently disordered. Yes, God loves them, and yes, they can be saved if they get themselves in order in some way or another, but constitutionally, they're inherently disordered. That's the phrase that was used. So unnatural, weirdly enough, is inherently disordered, but natural, nature, somehow magically is ordered correctly, according to the church perspective. Now, this has been around for a couple of thousand years, this what we now call heteronormative attitude, right? This has been around for a couple of thousand years, but in the past maybe 40 years or so, thanks to medical science, a phenomenon has emerged that has complicated this picture quite a bit. That emergent phenomenon is the transgendered individual. And I say it complicates this matter in part, in no small part, because the transgender individual, I mean, there's also what I've been sort of implying here is that, there's sort of an implication, a connection between nature and sexuality, right? And heterosexualism is normative. But the transgender individual, right? You have gender and sex involved in this. The transgender individual is a very queer individual indeed, because there is no, as far as I can tell, based on anecdotal evidence and the countless interviews I've done with my many trans friends, there does not seem to be a simple alignment, right, between sex and gender, between sexuality and gender identity. So, you have some phenomena. I have a very close friend who was assigned female at birth, transitioned, is now a very happy trans man. When Das is his name, was Denise, she was a lesbian, a really very hardcore committed lesbian as well. And when he transitioned, he still liked women. So for several years, he was a heterosexual trans man. But then over time, he discovered that he liked men, and is so now a gay trans man. And inverse story to that, another friend of mine, Cameron, born Catherine, also lesbian when before his transition, remained with his partner, happily married, adopting children, having a family, committed heterosexual relationship. So the fact of transition in terms of sex does not seem to have any direct correlation to, or in terms of gender, I should say, does not have any direct correlation to sexual identity. There are as many stories as there are trans individuals. So things do not neatly line up. Things are messy. Things are complicated. Things are queer, right? When it comes to talking about ourselves as natural beings, ourselves who are also sexual beings. So that's sort of oblique entry number one, this idea of the queer as an individual who is, has been historically determined as inherently disordered or unnatural, and who demonstrates through their existence that things are not as neat and clear and ordered as the Pope would like them to be. The second oblique entry has to do with this verb, queering. You may have heard this phrase before, queering the text. So I thought it might be useful to know a little bit about what that means. It has a very interesting history. It emerged in sort of two different academic discourses at more or less the same time in a complementary fashion. The first was in literature, really, textual studies. This is one of the areas where queer theory first began to take shape back in the mid-'80s and late '80s. One of the foundational texts of queer theory, it's an absolute must-read, is called the Epistemology of the Closet. The Epistemology of the Closet. It's by Eve Sedgwick-Klosowski. And it is exactly about what you think it is. It's about the structure of the closet and the kind of impact that it has on the queer individual. But she approaches the phenomenon by queering the text. And the text she queers in particular is the story of Queen Esther in the Bible. Esther has a secret, namely she's Jewish. And if she reveals this secret, she will surely be killed and condemn her people to death. If she holds on to this secret, then she might be able to continue on in her somewhat happy existence, but she'd be living a lie, right? Eve Sedgwick-Klosowski takes this fable, this story of Queen Esther, and the secret, the idea of the secret that she's holding, and then turns to the gay man, the gay individual, the queer individual, and talks about their secret, the closet. Remember, this is the mid to late '80s, and so being out was only just becoming a real possibility for most people. You know, you could not really be out and proud prior to the mid '80s. Most people couldn't. Many activists could be, but most individuals who had jobs, who maybe were working as a teacher, maybe working in the government, and in various other professions, to be out was a huge risk, because you would get fired, your career would be over, your life would be ruined, your social life would be destroyed, etc. And so this idea of the closet, this idea of the secret, was really an essential existential structure for the overwhelming majority of queer people, up until the '90s, when suddenly coming out was more than just a sort of activist thing to do, and was widely acceptable at the time. So this is what queering the text means. It means taking, at least in English literature studies, it means taking a well-known well-established text where you think maybe the interpretations have been exhausted, and finding in it the sort of queer secret, the queer subtext, and bringing that to the fore. And now queering the text, I mean, it's a little bit passé now in academia, but it was all the rage throughout the 90s. And so everybody was queering every text imaginable, from Dickens and Jane Austen to Shakespeare and Dante. And there were a lot of exciting English literature studies being published. And that's really one of the ways in which queer theory emerged. That was a big, important step. The other important step came from my field, philosophy. So there's two thinkers in particular, both of whom I know well, one of whom I studied with for a long time. Michel Foucault, first of all, who, quick footnote, did die of complications due to AIDS in 1984, while he was working on a series of books that are now collectively called The History of Sexuality. And they are themselves complicated texts, although Foucault is really, for my money, a very clear writer. Sometimes he's difficult and wordy, but the conceptuality, the conceptual structure that he's building, if you just take the time really to sort of diagram the sentences, is really quite clear. Foucault, in 2 words, was really all about how power is deployed in various forms. So the psychiatric and medical, let me tell you a little story about Foucault first. When he was a student at the École Normale Supérieure, he was from the provinces, so he was up in Paris. Paris was very exciting, and he knew that something was wrong with him. He knew that he liked men. And this is in the late 1950s, and so in Paris, even in Paris, very gay Paris, you would, if you wanted to go out to meet men, you would have to go to one of those clubs that didn't have any windows. You knock on the door with the secret knock, a little window opens, somebody looks at you, and then they let you in, right? So he would do this as a student, and then he would come back and would always feel dirty and shameful and awful, and so bad that he tried to commit suicide in the showers of the communal showers of the École Normale Supérieure. And as a result was confined to the clinic there. They had a couple of beds to observe students who might be in some sort of difficulty, like Foucault was, but mostly they had an extensive library of historical medical texts. And so Foucault passed all of his time looking at these medical texts and realized that, as I told you at the outset, homosexuality was a word that was only recently invented. The idea of it being abnormal was something that was only first from the church, but later on in the psychiatric and medical establishments basically asserted as such. You were sick, you were somehow sick, right? If you were homosexual. And, he said, I don't feel sick. I feel fine. So he started to think that, this is a form of what he called at the time discursive power. The discourse of medical science, the discourse of psychiatric science made these declarations and imposed them on everybody, right? We're scientists, we're wearing white coats and stethoscopes. We have all of the insignia of power. We have the appropriate investiture of power in virtue of our PhDs, etc. And so if we say this, then it must be true, right? So we started studying how power works, right? Discursive power in medical science, in psychiatric science, and even his, for my money, best book is called, in English, it's called Discipline and Punish. In French, it's called Surveiller et punir. It's to keep watch over, to survey, right? Keep watch over and punish. And that's about the history of, well, discipline, torture, first of all, but eventually a more generalized form of discipline, so that, the result, sort of ultimate punchline, is that when you're driving down the highway and you see that there is a sign that says slow down, radar enforced zone ahead. You know, somebody's watching you, and so you slow down. But guess what? There's no radar. Nobody's watching you. You have been disciplined. You have been trained. Power has shaped your possibilities in such a way that you respond to that sign in the way that you're supposed to. And even at the airports, I think they still say in the United States since 9/11, if you see something, say something, right? And so people say something. They're trained, their existential possibilities are shaped in such a way, power is imposed on them to make them complicit, to make them he has a word now, I can't remember, to make them the kinds of subjects that do what they're supposed to do, complacent subjects, right? And then he started looking at sexuality in his last phase, and the second volume in that book, in that series called The History of Sexuality, there's actually 4 volumes now. One was published posthumously. The introduction, which gave him a lot of problems, and later on he changed. Then there's one on Greek life. Then there's one on the early Christians, right? And the newest one is called The Confessions of the Flesh, The Confessions of the Flesh. So it's all about the idea of the pastoral confession and the kind of power that the priest, as an agent of the church, has over you as a parishioner through the catechism of the confession, right? You go into a box. It's semi-anonymous, except it's really not anonymous at all. You know who's on the other side. He knows who's on the other side. You confess all of your sins. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I have masturbated 626 times, right? And then you have to do your Hail Marys and whatnot to be forgiven. And if you don't do those, then you risk going to hell. Now, already the threat of going to hell is a form of power that the church has over you. They can absolve your sins or not. But the priest also now has all of this information about you, right? And so as an individual, he has even more power over you. So you will do what the priest says for fear that your secrets, again, may be exposed. So this was also absolutely essential. His work was absolutely essential to the formation of queer theory. And you can perhaps already begin to see some connections to what queer ecology is going to be about, which I'll get to in a minute. The other fundamental thinker is Jacques Derrida, with whom I studied for 6 years. And he's responsible for deconstruction, which is not a synonym for critique or criticism or analysis. Deconstruction is a very particular operation. And the basic premises are that the whole history of Western culture, maybe even more than Western culture, has been structured since the beginning, since the foundation, with people like Parmenides and Heraclitus. Western thought and civilization more generally have been structured through a series of binary oppositions. So Parmenides is all about being, right? What is absolutely or not at all. Heraclitus is all about becoming. Everything changes. You can't step into the same river twice, right? So you have that first opposition between being and becoming. And onto that initial one, you can map all sorts of other binary oppositions, like God and the human, or male and female, or active and passive, or immortal and mortal, or etc. You can name a whole series of oppositions that map neatly onto that initial one. And one of them is always given primacy over the other, always has a greater value over the other. So as you map those, of course, then being, God, right? The active, the male, immortality versus mortality, all have a privilege over their opposite terms. So the opposite term is always oppressed in a certain way and to a certain extent. Now, the operation of deconstruction is not simply to reinvert, another presence and absence. So speech, I'm here speaking to you right now. If you have a question, I can answer you directly. We're in the moment, but if you were reading a transcript of this, a written transcript of this, I would not be there to answer those questions. You would have to interpret. So there's the presence of the author versus the absence of the author, presence in speech versus absence in writing. So the operation is not simply to reverse those two terms, because that would just maintain the opposition in a different form. Reversal is one of a two-step process. The other one is generally called reinscription, reversal and reinscription. And so the lesser term that is now reversed has to be reinscribed with a different meaning that sort of undermines the standard opposition in various ways. And all of Derrida's works, I mean, hundreds of volumes, he was cranking it out all the time. All of his work is about reversing and reinscribing these various binary oppositions that have structured Western thought and Western culture. And people, lots of people have picked up his work and Foucault's work and taken it in really interesting directions. One of the most important, for my money, is Judith Butler, whose name may be familiar to you. She's still producing. She's, what, 65 years old, I think. They recently announced a pronoun shift, so I need to get used to that. But they wrote a really important book back in, I think it's the 1989 or 1990, called Gender Trouble, which borrowed heavily from Derrida and Foucault and Lacan and a bunch of other people, and initiated this discussion that is still very much central to many discussions about the difference between sex and gender, about the importance of gender, about gender as performativity, which, by the way, is not just dressing up like it's a show and performing a script. She means the performative as a linguistic category, like when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. That's a performative speech act, right? So out of that combination, Derrida and Foucault and their epigonies like Judith Butler and many others emerges sort of the other side of queer theory. You have these two sort of key discursive developments happening at more or less the same time. And yes, I can see in the comments that I'm abbreviating history. Certainly things go back further than that. You can talk about Mary Daly and a few other people in the 1970s, but really sort of the boom in theory is happening around that time. So now we have the idea of queer as unnatural, and we have this sort of operation of queering the text, which can mean either looking for the secret, looking for the queer subtext and bringing it forward, or looking for these kinds of binary oppositions and structures of power that are operative very often in a subtle, even unconscious way, and deconstructing them, right? So now, those are the two oblique entries. What does this have to do with ecology, or queer ecology? First of all, let me take one quick moment to observe that the professor who created the concept of the Gaia Hypothesis, James Lovelace, passed away 2 days ago at the age of 103. So the Gaia Hypothesis, you know, is that the Earth is alive. The entire Earth is alive. So life is not limited to organisms per se, whether they be human or animal or microscopic. Life is the entire Earth, pervades the entire Earth. So already what he's doing there with that idea is challenging another opposition between the organic, which is generally said to be alive, and the inorganic, rocks, which are generally said to be inert, right? Not alive. So the entire Earth is alive. The Gaia hypothesis is, as you know well, really important to the field of ecology, and shifted some of the tendencies in ecology. I think ecology as a concept, as an intellectual academic field, emerged back in the 1880s, and it was based on this opposition between the organic and the inorganic, and also still very much inflected with a lot of other binary oppositions, and held that the human in particular had some sort of privilege, because the human alone had reason, the human alone had intellectual mastery over concepts, was a special creature, was a privileged creature within the ecological system. And so again, you have another kind of binary there, where you have this human exceptionalism that exerts a kind of power over the nature in which it finds itself, the human, right? So, you know, that's human and nature, or if you like, nature and culture, as a kind of binary, where in this case it's culture and the human. This is sort of the original version of ecology, that has primacy, right? That has extra values, excessive value over the other term. So nature is there to serve us in some way, and our destination is to master nature. To control nature, to appropriate nature to our ends, to make it serve us more efficiently. You know, and so then you get all sorts of things like industrialized farming and industrialized animal husbandry, and trying to find the best ways to make the pigs produce as many piglets as possible, so you'll have tasty treats on the holidays, and etc. The Gaia hypothesis was a serious challenge to the original version of ecology, and because it challenged these ideas, first of all, that there was a separation between the inorganic and the organic, and that there was a separation between the human and nature. So it hence challenged this idea of human exceptionalism, first of all, and that our dominion over nature is our lot. So in addition to the Gaia hypothesis, you also had emerging in the 1990s another discourse called Eco-Feminism, which maybe you know about, which applied a lot of theoretical and really practical insights of feminism to ecology, and reminded everyone that, look, we always say things like Mother Nature, right? Nature is conceived of in our human language as feminine. And nature is productive, even reproductive. Nature seeks to produce and reproduce itself, right? So ecofeminism did something interesting there, but in response to ecofeminism, using the insights from queer theory, as I just articulated them, another discourse started to emerge that we now called queer ecology. And the first thing they did was say, well, look, ecofeminism has done some important work, but it's still relying on some standard binary oppositions, right? Simply maybe reversing them, but not reinscribing them, and not understanding, just as original ecology did not understand, but maybe James Lovelace did understand, that the kinds of things that we say about nature and the natural are things that we say about nature and the natural, right? We are projecting our human anthropocentric categories of thought onto nature and hoping, stupidly, that nature will fit neatly into those categories. But as we know, nature is queer. nature is complex. Queer theory embraces this complexity of nature and wants to call that complexity queer, so that it resists these kinds of binary categories. It resists these kinds of anthropocentric projections and complicates our discourses, our human discourses about nature. So, my notes, I've got to look a little bit more closely here because I can't read my own writing sometimes. So there's a rejection in queer theory of these dualisms, and there's this embrace of complexity, which it wants to call queer, and it recognizes that these categories of natural and unnatural are human projections. So when the Pope says, I'm inherently disordered, or homosexuality is inherently disordered, or when we have this common cultural notion that heterosexuality and heteronormativity are natural, right? Queer theory says, no. Those are human projections, and nature doesn't work like that. It rejects this thesis of human exceptionalism, just as the Gaia hypothesis does. And with regard to the heteronormative, again, in addition to sort of saying, no, it doesn't work like that, queer ecology wants to pay particular attention to marginalized groups, whether they be queer groups or groups marked by other forms of marginality, because those groups, like nature itself, tend to be exploited by power structures, right? In a way that has the effect of reaffirming the privilege of the power structure, reinforcing the privilege of the heterosexual, the heteronormative, the natural, etc. So there is a kind of complicity between the theoretical aspects of queer ecology and the political activism of marginalized communities. Again, my handwriting is terrible. And so, just as the Gaia hypothesis did, recognizes that fundamentally everything is interconnected in ways that most often, more often than not, exceed our understanding, right? And that any form of conceptual edifice that attempts to explain these, there's always a kind of a remainder, there's always a kind of leftover, there's always a kind of +1 that's outside of the system, a conceptual edifice attempting to explain it, that will threaten to destroy that conceptual edifice. So, this dates back really to, believe it or not, Kant, who was by no means a queer theorist, though he may have been queer. In the Third Critique, he talks about the sublime, and we tend to think about the sublime as like overwhelmingly beautiful, and it's not at all. The sublime is actually overwhelmingly terrible, frightening, terrifying, right? So the sublime is the earthquake, the tidal wave, the tsunami, right? And it's terrifying because humans, and think about, paintings by Caspar David Friedrich, where humans appear to be little tiny elements in this vast tableau of nature. Those things are going to destroy us. So we cannot think away the sheer terrible, sublime force of nature. We cannot contain it. We cannot merely represent it. It's always going to be in excess of any kind of conceptual framework that we create to try to understand it. That's fundamental to queer ecology as well. Any sort of intellectual framework is going to be unknowingly probably excluding something that will later on threaten to ruin it, to wreck it. I didn't have that in my notes, that just came to me. And then I'm almost done here. For queer theory, there are, for queer ecology, sorry, instead of being structured on merely binary oppositions or forces, there are multiple trajectories of force, multiple lines of force working in various ways, sometimes with each other, sometimes against each other, sometimes independently. Watching a lot of sci-fi helps to understand this as well. Star Trek is very useful sometimes, but multiple trajectories of force and multiple trajectories of matter as well. So not merely, gas, solid, and liquid, not merely scientific particles or subatomic particles, but even, we have, this is the title of Judith Butler's second book, Bodies That Matter. Bodies that matter, right? The materiality of the body and the way in which our materiality interacts with other forms of matter, other forms of materiality, are consequential in ways that we cannot always anticipate. Related then to queer ecology are two other discourses that are in vogue right now. One not so new, the other fairly new. The not so new one is called panpsychism, which dates back to Spinoza, actually, if not the Greeks. But pan, like all, and psyche, like the soul, panpsychism, everything is ensouled in some way. Everything has a kind of intelligence to it. It doesn't matter if it's organic or inorganic, right? So everything is ensouled. And there's a lot of people who are talking a lot about panpsychism in a renewed fashion right now. And so there's a real resonance of it with some elements of queer theory. And another more contemporary discourse is called object-oriented ontology, the principal exponent of which is Graham Harman, who was my roommate in graduate school for one summer. And he's a bit of a self-promoter, and he's always right about everything, I forewarn you. I mean that in a sarcastic way. But, his idea that, the fire and the cotton relate to each other in ways that are more sophisticated, more complicated than the phrase that we would use, fire burns cotton. There is an intimate life between the fire and the cotton that we humans simply cannot understand. There are networks of relations that exist between the wasp and the flower that becomes a fig later on in ways that we humans cannot understand. So following Deleuze and Heidegger in particular, Graham Harman tries to develop, and this idea has had it's very popular right now, it's very in vogue, and so a lot of people have been using it, including some people who work in the field of ecology, like Tim Morton, for example, and a few other names that escape me, Jane something, Jane Edwards maybe, have started to talk about the implications of for ecology. But there's also a real resonance there, I think, with queer ecology. Finally, last point. Queer ecology, it's not just simply theoretical, right? Although the theoretical aspects of it are important. There is, as I suggested a little while ago, a complicity between queer politics and eco-politics. So, for example, there have been in the past communities, lesbian separatist communities, for example, in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. And, you know, they grow everything on their own. They have their own agriculture, they have their own farming, they have their own everything. They're committed to the land. They're committed to a certain concept of nature and somewhat successful. And there's also these other movements like the fairies, right? The radical fairies who are LGBTQ, but who resist. They don't like the alphabet. They're not going to say LGBTQ. They're not going to pick one of those letters. They're going to call themselves radical fairies, in particular, by which they mean not only the derogatory name that people used to call us, but also the mythical creature, the fairy, who is intimately connected with nature and sees magic in nature. And so their politics is and their ethos, their ethics, is one that connects very deeply with a certain understanding of nature, a certain understanding of the ecological. And they are a big, interesting, fun community as well. Even individuals, individual existences, the intersection between queer politics and eco-politics is kind of interesting. Think about this phrase for a second. Crazy cat lady. Right? We've all used it. We all know one, the crazy cat lady. Well, you know, in all likelihood, not always, but in all likelihood, the crazy cat lady is probably a lesbian. And her cats are her companions. She has opted to have non-human companions. And these non-human companions, you know, complete her sense of identity or complement it at the very least, and inform how she views the world. She's not a crazy cat lady at all, right? She is somebody who has made an individual existential choice to abandon heteronormativity, heteronormative suppositions about what makes a couple complete, and to choose her future path with her non-human companions. So, you know, queer ecology embraces these kinds of individuals as well. So I said I was going to talk for only 20 minutes, and I did not keep to that promise. So I'll stop now. I'm always sort of amazed.
Thank you so much, Bob Valier. I've known you so many years and have been pronouncing your name incorrectly.
I lived in France for 15 years, so Valier is perfectly fine.
I've lived in France longer than I lived in the States. So thank you very much. I wish I had had you as a college instructor. That was so illuminating. Really beautiful presentation, Bob. I learned so much. I am especially grateful that you brought up Mary Daly, that you talked extensively about ecofeminism. I'm still trying to sort through how that departed completely from ecofeminism. You said it reversed oppositions, but didn't really reascribe them. Also, I want to say everybody is welcome to ask questions. I would love for you to type * hand up, so we've got a line, and Bob can begin answering them. We can discuss them, but I want to go on with my question. I understand from your talk that we are all a part of and custodians of the earth, especially those that are marginalized. You did not talk much about how this philosophy or this idea of our relationship to nature translates into how we act in accordance with nature. And I think that would be really important for us to explore together. And I wanted to say also, just as a tangent, that if people are looking for a great reference for pan-psychism, refer to Jeremy Narby, 2 wonderful books, Intelligence in Nature, also a fellow anthropologist from Stanford who worked in the Amazon, The Cosmic Serpent and Intelligence in Nature. So line up to ask questions. Bob, can you help us begin to explore how queer ecology translates into our relationship and actions in preserving nature?
So I was struggling with that question. I was thinking about including it, but first let me say the sort of philosopher who's really sort of leading the charge on panpsychism right now is named Philip Goff. Put his name in the box there.
But I don't know him.
I do, so it's okay.
I know. I know him personally.
Yeah. So, you know, I thought about this because I wanted to think, all right, what does this mean for policy? Right? What can queer ecology mean for like actual concrete policies? And, you know, I thought there was no easy way to answer that. There was no sort of recipe or agenda that I could concoct that would be like the queer ecology agenda that we would want to advocate to Congress. But I think what queer ecology can do, and maybe this is a framework for helping us select people to support, is shift our values, shift the way we think about our relationship to nature and what that means. And already, I mean, this is a little too easy, maybe, but sometimes the too easy is informative. You know, you have the certain politicians who are pro-business, big business, you know, and big business includes those big industrial sites that pollute like crazy, emitting carbon, et cetera. Those guys are driven by a set of values, not just the politicians, but the business owners. The values that drive the business owners is the business of business is business, right? We have to maximize value for our shareholders. And if we're constrained then by government regulation to have to limit our carbon emissions or clean up our act in other ways or not dump toxic chemicals into the river, then our shareholders are going to suffer and nobody's going to be making any money. Right, so you have one set of values there, which are instrumentalized, instrumentalist. Nature is an instrument, right, to be mastered, to be controlled, and appropriated in various ways and transformed into products that we can use. I hope everybody is enjoying their iPhone and their Zoom connections right now, because those two things are contributing to carbon emissions in various ways. But life is convenient, so we feel good about it. We can have these kinds of conversations and we can get things done and we can work from home, which maybe is not so bad because then we're not polluting with the cars. But in any case, you have one set of values there, and then you know, the values that emerge from queer ecology and ecofeminism and ecology in general. The sort of climate change agenda. I mean, even the climate change, the so-called Green New Deal could be queered a little bit more, right? It could be more radical in various ways. But in order to get the people who are going to make a real difference, namely politicians, to buy into that agenda, there has to be a fundamental shift in values, right? And that's not something that's easy to achieve. You know, I'm looking forward, I read, this is kind of a joke, but not really. The Biden administration announced that psychedelic therapy will be a reality within 2 years. So maybe we could just take all of these politicians to a psychedelic therapist and give them some psilocybin. And that might force a shift in their thinking. I'm only half joking when I say that. But that's the kind of thing that needs to happen. It's not just merely a policy agenda. It's a fundamental shift in attitude and value systems that has to be undertaken preliminarily.
I believe Isa had a question for you. He has his hand up.
Yeah. Our values are based on this system of gross national product, which pretty much makes everything of value that we really value valueless. And there are economists working today, people like Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, who have created economic set that is not based on gross national product. You know, how much cash does each person create in the economy? Can you recommend any economists that would we could look at for this?
Off the top of my head, no. But I can poke around a little bit and see if I can find anybody.
I've read quite a few articles about this kind of economics in The Guardian from time to time, but I don't have anything off the top of my head either, other than Sen.
Yeah, he has some interesting things to say about it. There was I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, the woman, I think in India, who won a Nobel Prize not so very long ago for microloans.
Yes.
Not Bangladesh.
Maybe it was Bangladesh, yeah, sorry.
The guy who founded the Grameen Bank?
Possibly.
Yes. Yes, I will tell you his name.
But there are serious economists who are developing, not the neoliberal economics. That's American.
Muhammad Yunus.
Economists.
I'm just scrolling through some things right now to see if any names pop out at me.
There are some economists that focus on circular economy, really objecting to this whole linear economic system, and that are being taken seriously and whose issues are being adopted by a lot of corporations now, taken very seriously.
Because gross national product is literally killing us, and we need an economics that values what's valuable.
So there's apparently a foundational paper in the UK called Blueprint for a Green Economy.
I think that's one of them.
But I don't know, I'll look around and see if I can.
Because we need to be able to bring real facts and figures to politicians. And if we're stuck with the neoliberal paradigm, it's impossible.
That's right. One sort of unfortunate thing is that anything that's not either neoliberal or conservative is going to be branded as Marxist and will indeed probably be informed by some Marxist ideas. So you'll have to combat that popular misperception about Marxist economics, which are all too easily confused with post-Marxist politics.
But which is why there has been a movement within environmental circles to refer to circular economy. There is no specific economist which is attached to that theory, but it's been accepted among both corporate and social movements that this is an essential part of moving forward in combating climate change, that our planet is not just, and our economy is not just constantly in need of building and progressing, that things must be recycled and circular. And that is accepted by I would say, mainstream environmentalist and being adapted by corporations like IKEA and many others.
Well, if you read Adam Smith, he rejected altogether corporations as part of a free market economy. Free market economy is personal individuals.
Okay, so you're a Marxist economist.
No,
corporations are not.
that's binarism as well.
Yeah.
If you're not Smithian, you must be Marxist. No.
Well, Adam Smith is more Marxist than anybody else today.
That's arguably true, I think.
But you know, the idea that corporations have a role in markets, he says it's not. You can't do that. You can't have monopolies. Monopolies are inherently unstable and destructive, which is what we see today.
Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But on a practical level, how do we move from point A to point B in trying to meet these existential challenges the planet is facing? We're not going to suddenly throw over all the large corporations. We must find a way to help them work towards a more sustainable future.
Well, they're destroying themselves, and we have to develop an economics which is able to show them how they're wrong. Without that economics, you know, I was a kid in the 40s and 50s, and there was no way I could be queer in the 40s and 50s, even though I've never been a male, never been a female. Not till the 70s could I have a word queer that I could use to think about who I am. So they can't think about it because they don't have a theoretical basis for changing anything, and it's killing us. I guess that's my hobby horse. Thanks.
Sure. It's a good hobby horse.
Do we have any other questions or reflections on Bob's presentation? Did everybody learn something? Christine? I don't know who's calling in from Czech or 127247, but if you want to unmute and share in the discussion, we'd love to hear from you.
I would love to get a brief set of references from the speaker in our in the email at some point, because you know, on my cell phone I can't really cut and paste that information.
What kinds of references would you like?
A basic author or authors that you're talking about. I know the queer authors, but I don't know the queer ecology authors.
Oh, okay.
I've never read anything in it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'll prepare a list probably this weekend because I have to go into the office here after this conversation, and then I've got meetings all day tomorrow. So on the weekend, I'll prepare something.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's a great presentation that you've made.
Yeah, Christine has remarked in the post she's not able to unmute at the moment. I'm very interested in climate change and this one area that I did not know much about. I'm glad to you, Dana, and Dr. Valier for the expertise and information you've provided in terms of how these two topics intersect and given me food for thought. I think that you've given all of us great food for thought. Bob, it's been, obviously you're a professional educator and funny and clear and well organized. So you've had a lot of practice in that. But I would like to go back to this, the relationship between ecofeminism and queer ecology. Briefly, if we can, if you don't mind, to understand better how that is departing, how queer ecology is departing from ecofeminism. Is it on a theoretical level or on a practical level?
Well, I don't know that they're I don't know that departing is the right word. I think, you know, the queer ecologists sort of emerged, and their first criticisms of the field, broadly construed, were of ecofeminism. And, you know, it sort of paralleled the critique that people have of second wave feminism as well, before third wave emerged. You know, second wave feminism was largely white upper middle class women who had the feminine mystique, you know, Betty Friedan, and who very frequently excluded women of color and their concerns, and were not then and still are not prepared to welcome trans women into the fold. You know, and so they maintain a kind of privileged position. They're defending their privileged position as white upper middle class women. And it was with third wave feminism when, and thanks to a wide range of feminists of color delivering a critique against those 1970s era feminists, that feminism broadened and became more attentive to intersectionality. I think the same thing happened with queer ecology with regard to ecofeminism. They saw that ecofeminism was still retaining a series of binary oppositions, not maybe possibly reversing them, but not reinscribing them. And so they were maintaining a system even though they were attempting to critique it. So thanks to the criticism of queer theory, I think ecofeminism embraced it and absorbed it and has become better for it. So I wouldn't say there was a separation or a departure. I would say that there was a very productive conversation.
It went further. It helped reascribe, or did it reascribe these binaries, or really just dissolve them by saying we are all custodians of the earth, that there is no separation?
I don't know that that either or is even sufficient. You know, there's multiple lines, right? So there might be some other possibilities there. But, you know, one thing that queer theory did queer ecology did quite effectively with regard to ecofeminism was to put the emphasis on intersectionality again. And intersectionality doesn't mean, let me be clear about this. It doesn't mean, oh, I have this marker and that marker and that marker and the other marker, right? Intersectionality means that, okay, yes, you do have those different markers, but then there are, there's an exponential multiplication of the forms and intensities of oppressive forces and exclusionary forces that are applied to you, right? So it's, for me as a kind of Foucaultian, intersectionality is not about occupying, having one foot in several different communities. It's about suffering really under multiple forms of power and having your existential possibilities limited significantly by those multiple forms of power. So I think what queer ecology did was sort of inject this notion of intersectionality into ecofeminism and made them more aware, the ecofeminists more aware of their own implicit biases. You know, they were mostly white academic women, right? And so it made them more aware of their implicit biases. And then once you become more aware of your implicit biases, you have an understanding that some of the things that you're saying, some of the positions that you're advocating may in fact be another form of discursive power that is restricting the possibilities of other groups with whom you should be in solidarity.
What a brilliant, articulate clear explanation, Bob. I'm so glad we have this recorded.
I don't know if I am or not, because if some of my colleagues in philosophy see it, they might say, what the hell are you talking about? You didn't use 5-syllable words.
We have another question, or we have a question from Christine. And she says, I'd like to ask if you know of any particular group, country, region, or even an example that comes close to the ideal of intersectionality in terms of climate environmental action. I may have missed this earlier. Apologies.
Well, for me, the short answer is going to be no, because you're asking about action. And, you know, I'm thinking about this purely from really the point of theory. I did spend some time thinking, what does this mean for policy implications? What does this mean for activism? And I quickly realized that I would do two things if I really went down that path. One is that I would double the length of my presentation, and already it was far in excess of what I promised. And two is that I'd probably open a kettle of worms, because you know, I might be recommending one form of action or some other form of action that would either be too minuscule or inattentive to something, and then everybody would want to propose, sometimes passionately, alternatives to that. So in terms of action, I mean, I'm not much of an activist anymore, especially, honestly, I'm sorry to say, not particularly on this issue. You know, this is, like I said, not my academic specialty, queer ecology, and so I spent the last couple of months reading a bunch of stuff about it, some of which I knew and in passing, and some of which was new to me. But I was, you know, because I'm a philosopher, I was more sort of intrigued by the theoretical texts than I was by the activist position. So that's my long answer, but my short answer is I personally don't know of action groups, activist groups that do.
Well, we as a council do pay close attention to activism and trying to inform people, educate people, help people to act in favor of the environment. And I'm a little biased, and I can't, it is not perfect, but I have to give a shout out to the country where I live, Finland, which is terribly heterogeneous in its population makeup. So it's not intersectional so much in that way, but there is, in terms of gender and attention to native rights and the type of national programs and positions that have been created and put into action. And Finland has the most ambitious climate agenda in the world to date. So if you're interested in finding out more about what Finland has achieved and is doing, Google it, or just write in environmental activism. And our government, which is made up, our coalition government made up mostly of women, and except for our secretary of, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's a gay man, who may be our next president, we hope. You will see a remarkably enlightened leadership coming out of this Nordic country. So, but not perfect. Does anybody have any last questions or comments before we wind up? Lisa, is your hand still up from the—
Okay, I
more to
just
say?
wanted to mention that recently I've been reading various ecologists partnering with First Nations ecologists in Australia and Canada, other places, which have a kind of after listening to this, I would call a queer ecology in dealing with and dealing with things like using fire and all kinds of. I've been reading a bunch of articles about First Nations ecology being studied and adapted by professional ecologists. But I don't have anything off the top of my head to share. But I just wanted to say that I've been reading about it.
Thank you. Bob, do you have any closing words?
No, but I got to go to work.
You got to go to work. Christine also says she's interested in learning more about vulnerable and disenfranchised groups as a part of the conversation. Well, we're trying to actually organize our next Climate Cafe jointly with the Disability Caucus, Christine, to look especially at these vulnerable and disabled groups and its intersection with our challenges with climate change and environmental issues today. So I hope we'll be posting a date soon for that in late August. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us and enlightening us. We really appreciate it. It was worth the wait from June. I hope everybody will consider joining in either virtually or in person in Amsterdam for Canal Pride, the first weekend of August. It's coming up soon. And we appreciate you being with us today. I'm going to stop the recording now.